What special skill or talent do you have? Why do you have that skill or talent? Hi, I'm Ranger Quinn, and welcome to Grant-Kohrs Ranch National Historic Site. We're standing in the lower yard of the ranch, just outside of the repair shop. Within the walls of this white wooden building with two big red sliding doors, it took no shortage of skill to keep a cattle ranch running. A skill that was especially important to ranching is found inside. Through these doors is a blacksmithing forge. Blacksmiths, or tradespeople who make things out of metal by heating them up and using tools to reshape it, were critical to cattle ranchers in the 1800s. Blacksmithing was also a skill that would become critical to cowboys and their survival after the open range was fenced in. But why don't you follow me inside and we'll start this story of skill and survival by lighting up the forge. Welcome to the shop. I'm walking in from the left to the right, and you can see wooden wagon wheels. As I go across the center of the shop, you can see a big cone-shaped mandrel, which is made for making rings out of metal. There's a big stove in the back, and across the back of the room, you can see all kinds of tools like a line shaft, which has big belts coming down and driving machinery like grinding wheels. There's also a big rack of horseshoes, and off to my right side here, there's an anvil and a forge. Why don't we go ahead and get this forge lit? Now that we have the fire going, I'm going to start adding some coal.
Here's a closer look at the coal we'll use. It's a large black rock with a slightly shiny surface.
I'm going to use my metal shovel with a long handle to take some coal out of the coal bin. I'm going to move it over the forge and lay it down around the outside edge of the fire. The coal is starting to burn pretty well, but if I want to get this fire hot enough to work on some steel, I have to put some water on it. I use my dipper made out of a soup can with a long metal handle to just drizzle a little bit of water around the outside edge of the fire. That seems crazy, but the water turns to steam, which boils impurities out of the coal. Those impurities look like this.
Have a closer look. It's gray and rust-colored. Some of its edges are smooth and round, others rough and sharp. We call this a clinker. It's a bunch of metals and other minerals in the coal that don't burn very well.
With those impurities gone, now we're left with this.
This is what the coal turns into. We call it coke. It has a jagged black surface and crumbles easily. It's also really lightweight. It feels about the same as holding a piece of styrofoam in my hand.
Basically a solid chunk of carbon, this coke will burn hot enough to get that steel up to about 2,000 degrees. Then that steel's going to be hot enough to reshape and bend. I almost forgot something. To make this fire really hot, we got to start blowing some air in there. I just turned on a fan called a bellows. It blows air into the fire and fans the flames to make it really hot. Now this one is really easy to use. It runs on an electric motor, so all I had to do was flip a switch. A bellows wouldn't have been so easy to use in Johnny Grant's time. A bellows would have looked like this in the 1860s. It's got two big wooden teardrop-shaped panels that open and close like an accordion. Now, I would have had to have used this thing and pumped it all day long in a blacksmith shop, and that would have been really tiring, but crucial, because everyone needed a blacksmith in western Montana in the 1860s. Look at this wagon wheel, for example. And the tire on this wheel is different than the ones on our cars today. It's made out of metal. You could see the thin metal strap running around the outside. Well, imagine yourself driving down a highway, far from anywhere, and a tire pops. You have no spare, and there's no tow truck that can come help you. However you would feel in that situation is how someone on this ranch would feel without a blacksmith. In the 1800s, only a blacksmith could fix this tire if it broke, or just about anything else. A lot of what people used back then was made out of metal.
That includes the heavy chains used to hitch horses onto this yellow Grant-Kohrs company wagon. It also includes the long metal handbrake seen on the side of the wagon and the metal springs under the driver's seat.
Only a blacksmith could make or fix those. That's why Johnny Grant built a blacksmith shop. Not on the ranch, though. He built it a couple miles down the road in the town of Deer Lodge. That way, everyone could get help from a blacksmith. He hired a very skilled blacksmith named Giles Olin to work in his shop. And Giles Olin was very skilled. Just to give you an idea of how skilled he was, he got stuck outside in the Deer Lodge Valley in a bad winter storm one year. Well, he got frostbite in his feet so bad, his feet got frozen so bad, they both had to be cut off. They were amputated. Well, Giles Olin made his own fake feet after that, and with some canes kept himself upright and still working in blacksmithing. So a lot of people needed his skill to get by. That included Grant-Kohrs after he bought this ranch from Johnny Grant in 1866. He was depending on the services of Giles Olin and other blacksmiths who were working in town, so Grant-Kohrs didn't have to have a shop here. But he was still depending just as heavily on them to make one of the most important tools for running his cattle ranch: cattle brands. During the open range cattle era, ranches turned their cattle loose on the Great Plains. It was the cowboys' job to find and round up the cattle for their ranch. But with no fences separating everyone's herds, how can that cowboy tell whose cow belongs to who out there? Well, they relied on a metal tool like this, made by a blacksmith. It's called a brand and has a long metal handle and two letters over a quarter circle shape on the end. Cowboys would heat this up in a fire and put it on the side of a calf. That burned the symbol into the calf's hide, marking it permanently.
Here, you can see me demonstrate branding on a round piece of wood laying on an anvil. It's red hot, and watch the smoke bellow off it as I press the brand into the wood. It burns a G laying on its side and a K into the wood. This is Grant-Kohrs Ranch's brand today. It's different from any other ranch. During the open range era, every ranch had its own unique brand. That helped cowboys tell their cattle apart from everyone else's.
But recognizing and reading those brands took a lot of skill. To be a good brand reader, cowboys had to learn a sort of secret brand language. A brand was read differently if the letters were in different positions or if they had symbols attached to them. Come on over here. I'll show you a few on my wooden brand board. It has the letter A burnt into it in different positions. I'll start with the one all the way on the left side of it. It's just a normal looking A, standing upright. Well, that's nice and easy. We'd call that an A brand. Well, if we move down the line here, somebody's taken that A and laid it down on its side, so the top point is facing off to the right. Well, if I was lying on my side all day long, somebody would probably call me lazy, and cowboys would call that letter lazy, so they would read this a lazy A. Next one down the line here has a quarter circle shape attached to the top point of the A. Well, cowboys would call this a swinging A. What happens if we flip that upside down? So now that quarter circle is attached to the two bottom legs of the A. It looks kind of like a rocking horse or a rocking chair, so cowboys call that a rocking A. Now this next A is normal A, but it's tilted off to one side. And I don't know about you, but if I tilt too far over to one side, I usually end up falling down. So cowboys would call this a falling A or a tumbling A. The next A has been flipped completely upside down, and a cowboy would tell you that's just plain crazy, so they call that a crazy A. The last A has that little rocking symbol split up and attached to both sides of the A, so it looks like it had little wings coming off to either side. Well, if it's got wings, it can fly, so cowboys would call this a flying A. Now, sometimes there might be a few different letters or symbols included in one brand. In that case, cowboys had to follow 3 rules to read that brand. The first one, you read from left to right. The second, you read from top to bottom. And the third, if there's something inside of something else, you read from the outside to the inside. I've got another example of that. So I'll take this brand right here. The shape on the outside is a diamond, and there's a letter E in the middle. Well, since we read from outside to inside, we would read this Diamond E. Now, remember that brand that I burned in that piece of wood? It's the ranch's brand. This, we read from top to bottom. So a cowboy would read this brand, Lazy G, hanging K, because that K is hanging off it. Because brands like these were the only way to find your cattle, brand reading was a valuable cowboy skill, and that skill came in handy when somebody was trying to steal your cattle. Out there on the range, there were a lot of thieves out there that cowboys called rustlers. They would steal your horses and your cattle when you weren't there. But to get away with it, they would take just a plain piece of steel with a flat end on it that they called a running iron, heat it up in a fire, and get a little artistic with your brand. So if they changed your brand, then they could fool everybody else into thinking that it was their cattle. They could keep it, sell it, and keep all the money from your cattle. To show you how tricky spotting an altered brand was for a cowboy, I've got an example for you right here. It's a 5-pointed star, and it has a line running right down the middle of it. This is an altered brand. A cowboy was expected to know that a rustler had changed this brand, but more than that, that cowboy was expected to know what the original brand looked like. So here's a challenge for you, cowboys. Can you spot the original brand here? I'll give you a hint. The original brand was 3 letters. Go ahead, just call them out as you see them. Okay, how about I show you what that original brand looked like? A good cowboy would have been able to tell you that this was an XIT brand. The XIT Ranch out of Texas. Funny thing was, they specifically chose the XIT as their brand because they thought there was nothing anybody could do to this where you couldn't find the XIT in it. So let's put that star back up here. I'll hold this a little closer for you. Can you see it now? The X is right here. That line running down the middle of the star, that's the I. And now the T is over here somewhere. Does that T look a little funny to you? There's a reason for that. During roundups, those cowboys are branding thousands and thousands of calves, and their branding irons are sitting at a hot fire all day long for weeks. Now, kind of like the steel that I heat up in the forge here, if it's in that fire long enough, it gets red hot, it gets soft, and it bends out of shape. Sometimes the T on the XIT, the top of it would bend and melt off to one side. Well, those clever little rustlers would target the cattle with the bent T on the XIT brand. Just one more challenge for cowboys out there, but it shows you how important it was to be an excellent brand reader. But now, what happens if one of those branding irons gets broken? Well, who do you think the cowboys take it to? The blacksmith. But that need for a blacksmith was actually going to change as time passed on the open range. Local blacksmiths might help ranchers and cowboys by making horseshoes. You can see a tall rack of different size and shape horseshoes behind me.
Some of these U-shaped shoes have roughed-up bottoms to keep horses from slipping on ice during winter. Others are smooth-bottomed summer shoes.
Cowboys needed metal shoes on their horses' hooves. Horse hooves are made of keratin, which is the same stuff our fingernails are made out of. Here's a little example for you. I'm holding a trimming from a horse hoof. It's tan and U-shaped, and all the holes you see in it are from the nails where a horseshoe was attached. If we scratched our nails against the ground, they would probably break and get worn down. The same thing happens to a horse's hoof, and it happens even faster when that horse is carrying a heavy cowboy on its back. Metal horseshoes stop that from happening, so a blacksmith was awfully important to a cowboy if they could make horseshoes. But after the American Civil War ended in 1865, railroads began to spread like a web across the country, carrying factory-made goods to the far west. Factories in cities like New York and Philadelphia had massive machines that could stamp out many of the things that blacksmiths had been needed for, including nails.
I'm holding a square-cut nail in my hand. This one has a large head that tapers to a long, thin point. If you were a blacksmith's apprentice, this was the first thing you learned to make and how you developed your skill. But Eastern factories could just melt the metal and pour it into thousands of nail-shaped forms called a mold.
Now those factories could make more nails more quickly, which made them cheaper to buy and easier to get. Where do you go to buy things that you can't get at a local store? Probably the internet. Well, in the 1890s, they had that.
Well, not exactly. But this thick brown book that says Montgomery Ward and Company in yellow letters on the cover was pretty close. This mail-order catalog from 1895 had just about anything you could want in it. You could buy one of the toy dolls on this page, pictured in black and white ink with prices listed next to it. Hey, the top model is $1.25. You can't beat that. And look at this page. You can even buy ranching equipment. The horse-drawn mowing machine pictured here in black and white with 2 wheels and a wide sickle bar on its side will come in pretty handy for haying.
It worked just like the internet works for us today. You send away money, and the thing you want is delivered to your doorstep. Even horseshoes. As those factory-made goods became easier to get, blacksmiths were needed less and less. If something was broken, just buy a new one out of the catalog. By the 1910s, many people thought that blacksmithing wasn't an important skill anymore, at least until 1929.
In October 1929, headlines reading "Stock Market in Severe Collapse" were plastered on newspapers across the country, like this historic copy of the Great Falls Tribune. The market crash sent the country spiraling into the worst economic disaster in its history, called the Great Depression. Sites like this boarded-up lumber and shingle company storefront became common as businesses and factories shut down. This North Dakota man, sitting outside the front door of his closed store in ragged overalls, joined the 1 in 4 Americans thrown into unemployment. With no jobs, little money, and little hope, families struggled to survive. Many lost their homes, including the North Dakota family in this 1936 black and white photograph. 6 young children sit in the sideboard of the family car. The boy on the right is standing barefoot in the rocky gravel, getting a drink from a canvas bag held by his father. This car was their home. How would you feel if a car was the only home you had?
Montana ranchers and cowboys were hard hit too.
Beef prices plummeted, forcing ranchers to sell off their cattle to survive. Severe droughts dried up watering holes, as seen in this 1936 photograph of a mounted Dawson County rancher. He moves his cattle toward a sun-baked pond where only a puddle remains. The droughts even destroyed their wheat and hay crops. In this black and white photo, a withered stalk of corn casts its shadow across the dusty earth. Fear and worry crept across Montana ranches as more of them fell victim to foreclosure. A look of worry in the eyes of this Montana farmer, who stands in front of horses with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his wool-covered chaps, reveals the new reality confronting cowboys.
In this reality, ranches couldn't afford to hire as many cowboys, and they couldn't just buy new things out of that catalog every time something broke. So imagine yourself in their shoes. Think about an important object that you rely on every day. If it broke and you had no money to replace it, what would you do? Cowboys and ranchers adapted. They did without or learned new skills so they could fix it themselves. Their ability to adapt kept the ranch running and helped them survive some hard times.
Conrad Warren, who is the grandson of Grant-Kohrs, became the ranch's manager in 1932. He is seated at a desk in his ranch office in this historic photograph. Pictures of cattle decorate the wall in front of him, while he, and his black and white spotted dog peeking up from below, gaze into the camera. He built this shop in 1935 as a repair center. It included tools and a forge to help he and the cowboys fix as many things as they could, by themselves.
If you could learn to fix things yourself, then you didn't have to spend any money to replace things when they broke. So what repair skills did cowboys have to learn? They had to learn some carpentry work so they could fix fence posts in the sides of barns. So they had to use a tool like this bit and brace right here. It's like an old-fashioned drill, except I have to turn the drill bit by hand. You can hear me do that. And they had to be pretty handy with a hand saw like this one. It takes a little longer than our modern saws. But you have to be able to do this so you can fix the side of a barn if it breaks, or cut down a new fence post. They had to learn how to fix sickle bars like this one I'm holding in my hands. It's very long. It's almost as tall as I am, and it's got a lot of little teeth that look like a saw blade on here. They use these things on horse-drawn equipment to mow the hay when they're harvesting it. But when you're out there, these thin little teeth that are triangular shaped, if this thing hits a rock, It's going to bend out of shape and you're going to have to resharpen it. So cowboys had to learn how to resharpen these using a sickle bar grinder like the one in front of me. It's got a hand-turned crank on it with a bunch of machine gears and then a V-shaped sharpening stone. Now cowboys would take the sickle bar, lay it in here, and then clamp it down with this little hand screw to hold the sickle bar in place. Then when they're ready, you just pull this up to the grinding wheel and turn that crank. Not something cowboys were used to doing out there in the field, but they didn't just have to learn to repair these things, they had to learn how to use all of these things too, including those mowing machines.
Cowboys were now expected to mow the hay and stack it. They had to learn how to operate hay stackers like the wooden framed one pitching hay high into the air in this black and white photograph. You can see a Grant-Kohrs ranch cowboy below, waiting to pile that hay into a stack. And they didn't just have to stack the hay. In this historic photo, another Grant-Kohrs cowboy is winter feeding cattle in the snow-covered pasture. He's now expected to stand on top of this horse-drawn wagon using a pitchfork to scatter hay across the ground. And on this ranch in the 1930s, cowboys had to begin working with tractors. The steam-powered tractor in this black and white photo was a new sight, and one that was here to stay. Black smoke belches from its funnel as it pulls a threshing machine across the ranch.
Cowboys couldn't just be open range cowboys anymore. The open range was fenced in by the 1930s. It was fenced in by farmers and homesteaders, and cowboys were confined to smaller ranches. And to keep their jobs on these smaller ranches, especially during the Great Depression, cowboys had to be able to do just about everything on a ranch. To survive, their old ways had to change. But one old skill became very important again: blacksmithing. When he built this shop, Conrad Warren included the forge to my side. That way, if any wagon parts, metal tools, or other equipment were broken and bent out of shape, he and the cowboys could just heat them up and try to weld or hammer them back together. If something was broken beyond repair, they could use the forge to turn it into something else. During the Depression, nothing goes to waste. Everything has to be reused. That includes turning a worn-out horseshoe into a hoof pick.
Here's an example. On the left is a worn-out horseshoe. On its right is a hoof pick made from a similar shoe. It was cut in half, and the cut end, seen on top, was heated and hammered into a hook. Now it's a handy tool to clean dirt out of your horse's hoof. Or maybe a broken wagon wheel tire can be turned into a new gate hinge. The hinge on this red fence gate is just outside the shop. It's made from a tire that was straightened out and then bent around the pin it swings on.
Today we call this repurposing. Using the forge to do this was a challenge for cowboys, however. They weren't trained blacksmiths. Today we can find videos on the internet to help us learn a new skill, but the cowboys who worked over this forge didn't have that. They learned by trial and error, or figuring it out by trying and seeing what happened. For me, it's fun, but for those cowboys, learning how to do this was a matter of survival. You know what? Let's step into the shoes of those cowboys. Let's try and see what happens when I use the forge to turn this piece of scrap steel into an S-hook.
Here's a closer look at what I'm starting with. We call this piece of steel square stock because it's long, narrow, and has 4 sides.
I'll start by putting one end of the steel into the forge. I'll use these tongs that I have. It has a long handle and a clamp on one end to hold the steel so I don't burn my hands. I'll leave the steel in the forge until it reaches about 2,000 degrees when it will be glowing red. Then I'll use this hammer, which has a big heavy steel head on it, to begin reshaping it.
It looks like our steel is glowing yellow, so I'll pull that out of the forge and set it on the flat top of the anvil. Let's hammer away. You can see me hammering on the end at an angle. That helps to draw the steel to a point, and it only takes a few hits with the hammer to get that point started. As I keep hammering, you can see that point getting longer. You might also see those little flakes of iron oxide, called hammer scale, falling off the steel. We'll give that a quick wipe off with my gloved hand. If I don't clean off that hammer scale, it'll create dents in the surface of my S-hook as I hammer on top of it. Okay, that point is looking pretty good, and just in time. The steel isn't glowing anymore, which tells me I need to put it back in the forge. Now I think we'll bend that end into a hook. We'll pull our glowing steel out of the forge and lay it across a spike-shaped attachment to the anvil. This is called a cone mandrel, and its rounded surface is perfect for bending our steel into a hook. Well, look at that. Just a few hammer taps, and it wraps right into a hook. It's a little off-center, so I'll lay it on the flat surface of the anvil and hammer it until the hook is flat. There we are. Our pointed end is now a hook. I'll put this back in the forge and repeat the process on the other end of the steel. Our steel is now bent into a happy little S shape. Ooh, you know what? Let's put a twist in the middle. I'm taking the hook out of the forge and clamping one end in a large vise to the right side. I'm using my tongs to hold the other end of the hook. As I turn the tongs, watch what happens. The red-hot steel in the hook's center twists like a candy cane. We'll straighten out a little bit. You can see the twist has a crust of hammer scale on it. We'll clean that off with the brush that has wire bristles. And with that, I'd say we have a finished S-hook. It's still hot, so I'll dip it into a wooden water bucket next to the forge to cool it down. And here it is, our finished S-hook. The steel is bent into the shape of the letter S, and the center is twisted, giving the metal a spiraled look. What do you think?
Might not be perfect, but if it works well enough to hang cookies, pots, and pans over the chuck wagon campfire, then I can help keep this ranch running. And I can keep my job. It was in shops like these that cowboys learned the new skills that they needed to survive the end of the open range era. These new skills, along with their willingness to adapt and meet challenges, carried them into our modern world. Cowboys never disappeared. They're still around us today. We just call them something else. Ranch hands. And they're still using those skills and that adaptability to feed the nation. So maybe we can learn something from those cowboys and their willingness to learn and change. So the next time life throws you a challenge, think about that cowboy and this S-hook in my hand. How will you reshape yourself to survive?